All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for taking a pause from your very exciting hackathon projects. I hope they're going well and you're having a good time and a good experience. Um, I have to say it's a real honor that we all get a chance to listen and learn from a space legend, Bruce Pittman. For background, Bruce is the chief systems engineer at NASA, and he's also the VP of development at a satellite company named SkyCorp. Bruce, you've had a long and storied career, so I struggle to decide how to introduce you because you've done so much. But I think the most important things for me have been your long career at NASA, and you really seem to have had a almost prescient sense of what's around the corner in terms of space and where to focus your career. But I'd love to start. I've been fascinated with space ever since I was a little kid. And I wanted to ask you, what is your first memory of being fascinated with space?
That's a good question. When I was like in third grade or something like that, I was going with my mom through a department store, and we went through the kids' book section, and I saw these books. There, these little hardbound books, for kids, and it was called Tom Corbett's Space Cadet. And so I bought a couple of those books and was reading about the exploits of these, young people. It was kind of, like it was a military academy or something like. So these were, college age students or something like that, who seemed incredibly old to me at the time. But they were zooming around the solar system, and I thought, wow, that sounded like great fun. But it was all pretty much the fantasy. And then when I was a little bit older, John Glenn went up on my to orbit, in the first time for an American went to orbit was on my birthday. And that kind of got my attention, as few things did at that age. And that's when I first started paying attention to what was going on in the real world of space, because everybody else talks about Sputnik, but I was too young to remember all that. And so it was just kind of like, but I remember the John Glenn thing. And then after that, I started paying attention. And my dad was in the Air Force, so I was around airplanes and all that kind of stuff my whole life. So it just seemed like a natural thing to do. And when I got a chance to join NASA, I jumped at it and, kind of never looked back.
Well, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. I love that you mentioned the Space Cadet book. I loved to read when I was younger, everything that Robert Heinlein wrote. And when I was older, I loved to read everything that Kim Stanley Robinson wrote about the Mars trilogy, et cetera. How about you, other than the Space Cadet?
On the shelf back there, up on the bottom shelf there of the big long thing up at top, that's every single book that Heinlein ever wrote. So I was like you.
Did any of
them? Actually, this is a fun story. I actually put on a conference and invented an award just to meet him.
That sounds like a great story.
It was called the Tomorrow Starts Here Award. And actually he showed up and it was great. And I got to have dinner with him and it was really cool.
Wow. Well, other than Heinlein, which I think we could talk about for a while, were there any other books or movies or other media that really sparked your interest in space exploration and what the future might look like? Well,
the other one, I don't know if you can see it here, but that's an original poster up in the corner there from 2001: A Space Odyssey. I couldn't afford one in English, so I got one in French. So that came out when I was a teenager, and I was so excited. I drugged my dad to see it, and through the whole thing, he was going, "I don't get it. I don't get it. I don't get it." But I loved it.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. I'd love to talk a little bit about your career. As I said, you always seem to have been at the forefront of the ways in which space evolves and space exploration evolves from um, perhaps a model some of us who are older grew up with, was that governments were seen as the core of space programs for many decades, and really since World War II, even though the first commercial satellite was launched in the 1960s, and certainly defense and aerospace contractors have been involved in building rockets and other technology to support space missions for a long time. But how did NASA manage the risk of those relationships under that older model?
Um, that's a good question. If you kind of go back to the early days of the space program, remember the number one thing was speed. With the entire Apollo program, the whole idea was to get to the moon. So they weren't interested in efficiency. They weren't interested in necessarily the longevity of the program. It was just beat the Soviets to the moon and fulfill the presidential mandate. To do that, they had a very kind of command and control kind of methodology. A lot of the guys that were implementing this had come out of the military, and so they adopted this kind of top-down, rigid, hierarchical approach to that. If you can think about being a really small cog in a really big machine, that kind of gives you an idea of what it was like. And it was very, I would say effective, because there was enough of a motivation to get everybody rowing in the right direction, because it was kind of a compelling goal. But it certainly wasn't very efficient in the fact that it took 500,000 people, to pull this off. Jeff Bezos had an interesting concept, comment on this. He said, what we did with Apollo is he said we pulled it out of sequence. We shouldn't have been able to do that. And we did it just to show that we could do it. But then once we did it, we couldn't support it. It was because we had pulled it out of sequence, and it was so expensive, and it was so challenging to do it that's why we haven't been back in almost 50 years. The last mission was in December of 1972. So it's been, next year it'll be 50 years since we've been back to the moon. Now we're finally getting ready to go do it again. But like I said, it's been half a century. So, and then what a lot of us came to the conclusion of, I joined NASA right at the end of that whole thing in the kind of the mid 70s. Right as that whole thing was winding down. And the thing that became clear to us is that you needed to find a better way. There had to be some more flexible, more agile, more kind of efficient way of doing these kinds of things. And so that started me on this quest that's lasted, like 30 or 40 years now. To find that better way. And one of the tools that we found along the way that my NASA colleagues, and I worked on, starting in 2005, was this idea of public-private partnerships, where the government gives up some control, but in exchange for that, what they get is true partnership, rather than somebody that's just going to do what you tell them to do. And then if you tell them to do something different, they'll go do something different. But in that command and control world, the government takes all of the risk, because it's done under what's called a cost plus contracting methodology, where basically the government pays for everything, whether it works or not. Where in this new methodology, what you do is you do this partnership, and then the government is still paying at least part of that, but you're only paying for performance. If they don't meet the milestones, you don't get paid. And so we found that to be quite, it definitely focuses the mind and gets people to think about not just performance, but time and money.
Right. That's a pretty strong incentive. And since you mentioned the, sort of what opened your eyes to joining NASA in the 70s and what we were doing at that time, I remember that in the 80s, when the space shuttle program was at the fore of everyone's mind, that's one of the first times that actually there was the beginnings, let's say, of NASA partnering with the private sector. What do you think changed to make that possible in the 80s?
Well, I think there was a couple of things. One was that the budget was going down. So NASA couldn't afford to do things the way that they did. I think a number of people were getting frustrated with the just how cumbersome the system had become. If you'll remember, I was still a civil servant during the early days of the space shuttle. And I remember when they were originally going to plan this, this thing was going to fly 50 times a year, and they were going to be like $10 million a flight. Well, when all is said and done, the most it ever flew in any one year was 9 times, and it averaged less than that. So over 30 years, it flew 134 flights. So you can do the math there. And when you take all the costs and divide it by the number of flights, they were about, instead of $10 million, they were $1.6 billion a flight.
Wow. So
now that includes the development costs and everything, but even if you do the operational costs, it was probably still, over $1 billion, so they were off by 2 orders of magnitude. So you kind of go, we can do better than this. We can, something's got to give here. And so people started experimenting a little bit. And when I left NASA as a civil servant, one of the first things I did is I joined a small company, part-time, Space Hab, and they actually did the first public-private partnership with NASA on the Space Hab module in the space shuttle. And that was another one of those weird kind of surreal kind of experiences where there was a whole bunch of people in the system there that didn't want this to happen. They didn't really want that module to ever really exist, because we were competing with the ESA and had developed this. It was called Space Lab, but Space Lab cost 10 times as much to fly as Space Hab, and so they basically couldn't afford to fly it. But ESA put a ton of money into it, and so they weren't real thrilled to see us come along and offer a cheaper alternative to that. But and I was only with this company for a few years, so I don't want to take too much credit for this. But during that very early days when we were trying to sell this and going around and trying to find customers and to establish the requirements and everything, it was quite a. And again, this was some of the experience that I used, 15 years later when they were trying to do the COTS program, the Commercial Orbital Transportation Services, that was going to deliver the cargo to the International Space Station, to come up with an approach and advocate an approach that would use the same mechanisms here, which are called, funded Space Act agreements. So anyway, it's one of those things that, if you're lucky and you pay attention, you can use the lessons you learn along the way, hopefully to help get smarter over time. One of my colleagues at NASA, she said, we reserve the right to get smarter with time. And I've always tried to remember that.
That's great. And I can't wait to talk about COTS, because I think it's fascinating. And it's probably more relevant to those of us who've been following space exploration in the past 10 years or so. But talking about Space Hab for a minute, that I didn't realize, honestly, that that was the first public-private partnership, that it, and again, for context for everyone on the call, that was really, as we saw in a picture, it was a space research laboratory that nestled into the cargo bay of the space shuttles. And if I remember correctly, this flew on missions for the space shuttle starting in 1993.
Right.
So that must have been fascinating at that point, well beyond most of us are aware of that public-private partnership. What was it like working at a startup environment that's near and dear to our hearts at that time?
It was kind of crazy. I mean, when I joined the company, there was 5 or 6 of us, that were running around the country trying to get NASA to pay attention to us. And I had been an insider. I had worked for NASA, so I kind of knew people and all of that. And but it was still you know, kind of my kind of takeaway message in the first couple of years was, you know, like, was the message they seemed to be getting across to us. It was kind of like, what part of hell no don't you understand? But we were fortunate, you know, to be in the right place at the right time, because what had happened was, just kind of say where was the customer pain point here that we were trying to meet, was in the mid deck of the space shuttle, you know, in the main part of the space shuttle on the second floor. It's a kind of like a 2-decker. But one of the things you need to understand about the space shuttle is it's tiny. I mean, when you look at the pressurized volume there in the mid deck there, I've actually been in the space shuttle and I could reach out and touch both walls.
Wow.
I mean, and so when you put 7 people down there, it's really cozy. And on one wall, there's a series of what are called mid-deck lockers. And in all the flights, there was usually a few lockers that were empty. And so they started offering those up as a place to do experiments. And so scientists, being very creative people, they would find a way to cram their stuff into this 2 cubic feet space just because they wanted to fly in space. You know, they wanted their experiment to go to space. And so what happened is NASA put out started making these deals to fly these mid-deck lockers without talking to the people that actually controlled the mid-deck lockers. And so on one hand, you had NASA had signed all these deals for 100 of these locker flights. And when you talk to the people that actually controlled the lockers, that would have taken them like 50 years to fly, you know, all those experiments. So you had this, basically, they had made promises they couldn't keep. And so where Space Hab came along was we offered them some additional space to put these mid-deck lockers that they could fly these experiments in. And so it was this weird deal in that we paid for the module, we, you know, owned it and operated it. But since we flew in the space shuttle, we had to rent the space from them. And then they rented space in our modules for so many lockers on each flight. So it was this weird kind of offset thing that we were doing. And that you paid, the thing I remember that was really kind of cool is you paid for your space in the shuttle cargo bay by length. So how many feet of the cargo bay did you take up? And so fortunately, one of the guys in our team was a civil engineer, and he had come up with a way of making flat end caps, because on the space lab, they were conical and took pretty much this, and we had flat end caps and then tension bars on the inside of it. So it was this weird thing. You know, frankly, when we started this whole thing, I didn't think it would work. I just didn't. If I had known it was going to work, I would have asked for more stock, you know, so.
Well, thank you. That was fascinating for me to learn that really the public-private partnerships and starting down the path towards proving the value of being able to do commercialization in space. It fascinated me to learn that it started so early. But you mentioned earlier COTS, and you did play a key role in developing NASA's COTS program, which stands for Commercial Orbital Transportation Services, if I have it correct.
Right.
And the goal of that was to use private companies to deliver crew and cargo to the International Space Station. Can you tell us about what were some of the challenges of shifting the mindset at NASA from that really strong in-house development of orbital transport to opening it up to commercial options?
So remember, this was right after after the loss of the Columbia in 2003, and then in 2004, January of 2004, President Bush 43, the Bush 2, came out with his vision for space exploration. Mm-hmm. And so in that, they said that in 2010, once the space station was assembled, they were going to retire the space shuttle because of safety concerns and a bunch of things like that. So that put NASA in a bind of, well, they had just spent all this money to build the space station. Then what were they going to use to, one, get supplies to and from it, because that's what the space station had been used for. And then finally, what were they going to use for getting the crew up and back? Because it'd be pretty stupid if we put all that money into building a space station and then couldn't get any of our people there.
Yeah.
That was not going to be a good thing. So again, Bill Gerstenmaier, who was the head of the space station program at the time, years later, he came up with this phrase that I thought was really good. He said it was innovation through desperation. He said, we were innovative, not because I wanted to, not because I really thought this was a great idea. He said, but I had no choice. We needed to do this stuff to be able to survive. And so he had to do these things that he did on the COTS program. And so he took a risk on two small companies. One was Orbital Sciences. Well, I won't go through the whole long story, but yeah. So it ended up with two companies. One was SpaceX. And at the time, remember when they got this thing, they were formed in 2002. So they got this contract in 2006. They hadn't launched anything to orbit. They hadn't even launched anything to space, but they had some good ideas. And then Orbital Sciences followed a little bit later. Now they had actually flown some stuff into space, but they had never launched anything into space. They had or nothing this big into space. So it was a pretty big risk. And then NASA was putting all of its money into a program at the time that was called Constellation. And remember, that was the Ares 1 and the Ares 5 and that whole thing. And so this was kind of like a backup to that a lot of people didn't think this was going to work. And I think that's one of the reasons that they were willing to try it, because I think a lot of people that normally would have fought it said, hey, this is only $500 million. You can't do anything like this for $500 million, especially for two providers. And so I think a lot of the people didn't really take it seriously until it was too late. So they started in 2006. SpaceX made it into orbit in 2010 with the Falcon 9, 2008 with the Falcon 1, 2010 with the Falcon 9, and then they actually docked or birthed to the space station in May of 2012. And it was kind of surreal. We were doing a big meeting on the National Space Society, this International Space Development Conference in Washington, D.C. And so I'm sitting in the front row of this meeting, and Charlie Bolden, who was the NASA administrator, is standing in front of us and speaking. And on the screen behind him is the Dragon capsule just being birthed with the space station. And I was just kind of going, I mean, this was a moment, you'll never forget, that this is when, the quote unquote new space thing really, to me, came into being when they did something that so many people thought couldn't be done. And they did it the first time.
That's amazing. It's incredible to me to think how quickly you were able to see those results from the seed funding from COTS into SpaceX in 2006. And then, as you mentioned, 2 years later, we saw the Falcon launch. And then by 2012, we actually saw the Dragon capsule birthing. And I think for a lot of us on the call, that might have been a reawakening moment of realizing, as you said, this new era of space. So thank you for giving us the boots on the ground perspective of what it was like to be there for that. One thing you, as you talk through these things and in some of your writings, you've really been involved in the concept of space infrastructure for some time, and perhaps it's been pandering to the crowd because we are the group of infrastructure engineers here at Instacart. But one of the things I'd love to touch on is in 2010, you led NASA's analysis of the in-space fuel depot, which I think the goals there were to reduce costs and expand the range of where we could go in space. So I'd love to hear more about that, the fuel depot idea, and more broadly, how has this concept of space infrastructure evolved?
Well, this is where engineering and orbital mechanics and politics kind of come together. If you're any kind of an aerospace engineer, you realize that if you can refuel things in space, that gives you a lot of capability that you wouldn't normally have. And I mean, Mike Griffin was a pretty smart engineer. He was the NASA administrator from like, he was the one that, you know, basically started the COTS program and everything. It was actually started by the guy before him, Sean O'Keefe, but when he came in, he basically adopted it and implemented it. But he made an interesting comment, and I also happened to be in the room when he did this, and this was in Houston, Texas at another meeting, and he said he didn't want to build orbital propellant depots, but if somebody would, he said he would pay $10,000 a kilogram for propellant on orbit. And so this started just a firestorm of activity of people trying to do that. One of my good friends was at Boeing in the time, and he started working on this and trying to come up with ideas for propellant depots and showed the kind of leverage that being able to refuel things in orbit. What that allowed you to do is you didn't need a super massive rocket to do the same mission. You could use a smaller rocket and then just refuel it, add additional propellant to it. Now the problem is you had a whole bunch of people, remember that Constellation program with the Ares 1 and particularly the Ares 5. Well, the people that were wanting to build that Ares 5, they didn't want a propellant depot, because if you had a propellant depot, then you didn't really need the Ares 5 anymore. So they were just, you know, kind of no propellant depot. It's too risky. This orbital rendezvous and docking is just way too risky and everything. Now, the fact that we had just done, you know, dozens of these literally, you know, to build the space station, and now they're trying to say that trying to do the same thing, even, you know, something, you know, less risky than that, was now all of a sudden this was a big, you know, bad thing, you know, that we didn't really know how to do. So it was kind of foolish. The thing that really ticked my colleague and I off was that the reason that they used for dissing the propellant depot was they said there's not enough launch capability to be able to launch the propellant into orbit. And we're kind of looking at each other and say, oh, come on, you guys can lie better than this. You guys can come up with a better excuse than that. So we went back and that's where we did this analysis and showed, no, there was more than enough capacity out there in the launch vehicle market. Like if you went to ULA, which does the Atlas and the Delta, and you said, I want to buy 10 more, Atlas 5 launches, would they have sold them to you? Hell yes, probably would have given you a hell of a deal on it too. But it just shows you that just because you're right and just because you got the data doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to win. But, just to show you that if you stick to your guns long enough, but you notice that the other person that's adopted this idea of refueling on orbit is Elon Musk with his Starship. And so that's actually one of my colleagues, who shall go nameless, actually is friends with Elon, worked with him on the development of what's called Pika X for the Dragon capsule. And so he sent him this stuff and just showed him, if you could refuel on orbit, what kind of capabilities this gave you towards going to Mars. And, and I don't know what role this played, but Elon did end up adopting that philosophy, and now they're going to do it. So key to this Starship being able to go to the moon and to Mars in particular is this ability to refuel on orbit.
That's fascinating. And I know you've written and spoken about the idea of getting reusable mass into space. Can you give us an overview of what are the challenges of launching mass into space?
Well, I mean, one is you got to go real fast, real quick, so you've got to go from 0 to 17,500 miles an hour in about 8 minutes. That's a non-trivial thing to do. All the stuff that you have to take up there has to be packaged so that it survives in that environment. I I mean, I remembered I was talking to some of my friends and I told them I was going to be giving a talk for Instacart, and they were really kind of confused about why you guys would want to do that. And I said, no, this is going to be their new delivery service. I said, yeah, it's $29 for the groceries and it's $12 million for the delivery, you know.
You caught us.
But yeah, so the new thing that's come along, and again, got to give credit to Elon for this, is that the idea of reusability is finally entering into the lexicon. And that's kind of what takes space hardware and turns it into space infrastructure, is if you can use it for more than one thing. If you can reuse this stuff, that's kind of my definition. I don't know if you'll find that in the dictionary anywhere, but that's one of the things that I use as a definition of what makes infrastructure, is when you can apply the same thing to do more than one mission, or to do, so it's not like, use it once and throw it away. It's not like a disposable thing, or it's not a bespoke thing that you can only do this one thing and it can't do anything else. So
that's interesting. One challenge we face in infrastructure engineering is ensuring that the services we build are usable by a pretty broad array of other teams that are delivering their own services. As more and more players enter the space exploration market in these public-private partnerships and the real rise of private space exploration, does that complicate the idea of developing standards that can be usable universally?
I don't know if it makes it more challenging, but it certainly makes it more important. And then the question is whose standard do you adopt? And so this is where a lot of people are putting, like one of the things that I'm working on right now at the company that I'm with right now is we're trying to make us, we're flying an experiment in space in February that has this connector that provides both mechanical, electrical, and data connectivity between various modules in a space system. And it's kind of, really flexible and everything. So anyway, we're trying to propose this as a standard for doing these kinds of mechanical data. Now, there's a number of other people that are out there trying to do the same thing. So it's always interesting to see how these standards evolve. And if you're old enough to remember the VHS versus Beta, Beta was better, but VHS won. Why? Because it was an open standard.
Yeah.
So we're trying to learn that lesson and trying to turn this into an open standard and allow, multiple people to make it and multiple people to use it.
That's great. Thank you for the context. You mentioned, you talked a little bit about the challenges of getting mass into space and reusability. The original model for how we would support the International Space Station was based in having low Earth orbit spacecraft constantly supplying and resupplying and replacing entire systems as a component on the space station. But this is shifting to a model in which now there's sort of component level fabrication and repair of those components that's actually happening in zero gravity on the space station itself. What led to this trend of in-space manufacturing?
Well, I mean, that had always been kind of the holy grail, the kind of the goal of it. It's just nobody had been able to do it. This is where another company that kind of grew out of the NASA Ames Research Park, a company called Made in Space, they had a public-private partnership starting off with an SBIR, the Small Business Innovative Research grant from NASA to develop a 3D printer that could print things in space. Now, they thought that it'd be relatively easy to take a printer and make it work in zero gravity, and they found out that wasn't true at all. And so they did a number of these. I don't know if you've seen these zero-G parabola flights where you can get very short amounts of simulated, it's not really, zero gravity, but it's kind of like milligravity, so people can float around in there and all that. So they did a number of those parabolic flights, and then they were able to kind of work the bugs out of their system. And then they eventually, flew it to the space station. And so now they've won a number of things. That company has now been bought by Redwire, and Redwire just SPAC'd, and so it's now a public company. So a lot of these people, and this was a spin out from Singularity University. These people, and so we were one of the mentors and reviewers for that program, and there was only like 3 of us that thought this was a good idea, and so we were encouraging these kids to go on, and everybody else was kind of going, that's kind of stupid, and all that. So again, I'll pat myself on the back a little bit, my colleagues and I, that we at least we thought it was a good idea.
Yeah, and some of the most fascinating things I saw when I was researching this topic was how far back this went. I mean, I think the Soviets were experimenting back in the 70s, if I remember correctly, with how to create different matrices of crystals in space, et cetera. But today, one of the most fascinating pieces I saw was how you can create better fiber optic cables, basically, in low gravity environments. What other sort of things do you see that are either happening today or around the corner in terms of really exciting in-space manufacturing?
Yeah, that fiber optic cable, that's actually one of my colleagues was kind of, 2 of my colleagues, were kind of looking through all of the results of the space station and everything, and they came across some work that had been done at the Marshall Space Flight Center back in the 90s on some stuff called Z-blend. It's one of these exotic fibers, and it had basically been dropped. And so one of my colleagues, she was the one that kind of went to Maiden Space and told them about this stuff, and they kind of poo-pooed it. They were too busy, and so she kind of insisted, no, you need to go pay attention to this. And so now Maiden Space is doing one of those. There's 3 or 4 other companies that are doing this right now. And the neat thing about this is, with this fiber, with 1 kilogram of preform, you can pull about 3 or 4 kilometers of this fiber. And if for the really high performance fiber, you can sell it for about $3,000 a meter. So you can start seeing where there could be a market for this. So it's not quite ready for prime time yet, but I think within the next couple of years you will. So exotic fiber is one of them, and Z-blend is just the first one. In the biotechnology area, there's biological crystals, protein crystals that you can use for drug discovery, both what's called, forgive me for nerding out, aqueous and membrane proteins. Aqueous are much easier, membranes are much harder but more valuable. And 40% of the stuff that you'd really like to use as drug targets are membrane proteins, but they've made some good progress on being able to crystallize those in space. The more fascinating thing, though, is what are called 3D cell cultures, where you can actually make organ bandages and ultimately artificial organs. They're talking about people, they're talking about being able to print hearts and lungs and kidneys and things like that in space. Now, again, not ready for prime time, but that has the potential, because if you look at the number of people that are on organ donor lists that will more than likely die because there's not enough donors out there. So this could be, and the neat thing about this is you could take somebody's own stem cells, take it to space, grow one of these organs, and then bring it back and transplant it. And you don't have a fear of rejection because it's their own cells.
Right.
So you don't have to take all these immunosuppressants to keep from having the rejection of the tissue. So that was one of the things that got me started, on this back in 2005, when my friend Lynn Harper was telling me about this. And we titled this "The Greatest Story Never Told."
Well, speaking of that was really fascinating. Thank you. And we could nerd out on that one for a long time. I was really fascinated to learn about the barking, the change of the bark that grows on the outside of fiber optic cables, and how that changes in low gravity environments, as well as some of the advances in insulin crystals.
Yeah,
those are fascinating to me. So I'll try to curb my enthusiasm there and ask about something that I think you have a little bit of an interest in. Now, it's no secret that Elon Musk wants to build a colony on Mars. I think we all know that. But in I think 2014, you wrote a paper entitled "Lunar Station: The Next Logical Step in Space Development."
Right.
So I think you have a little interest in building a lunar base. Can you tell us why you think that's so important, and why is that a stepping stone potentially to Mars?
Yeah, because I mean, it's like if you wanted to go on a, you know, climb a big mountain or something like that, you know, or go on a big expedition, and you know it was going to last for months and all that, and the only thing that you'd been able to do to prepare for this is camp out in your backyard. You know, it's probably not going to give you, that's kind of what low Earth orbit is. It's right next door. If something goes wrong, you can go into the house and get you know, a peanut butter sandwich, or you know, whatever it is you want. Where Mars is really far away. I mean, it's going to be really hard. It's going to take a long time to get there. And if something goes wrong, you're an awful long ways from home. If you've seen any of those pictures from the landers on Mars that basically show you what Earth looks like from Mars, and you can see this little dot out there, well, that's home. You know, that's the nearest, you know, Rite Aid or Walgreens, you know, or CVS is an awful long ways if you need an aspirin or a Band-Aid or something like that. So the idea about going to the moon is it's kind of that interim distance. It's about 3 days away, but it's far enough away, and you're on the surface of another planet. It's not exactly the same as Mars. But the other thing is, I'm part of a group called the League, the Lunar Exploration and Analysis Group, which was established by NASA, you know, about 15 years ago, to basically look at what you could do with the moon, both from a scientific and a commercial point of view. And so the idea is, one, there's a lot of useful material on the moon. Two, there's some of the coldest real estate in the solar system, and possibly even in the universe out there, in these permanently shadowed craters on the poles of the moon that have, you know, large quantities of water and other valuable materials in it. And some of the earliest materials that were made from the formation of the solar system are there, that are available to you for research. Where on Earth they're been destroyed by the weather and everything over billions of years, but on the moon, although it's been bombarded by asteroids and comets and things like that over those billions of years, those are actually interesting remnants as well. So although it kind of looks like a pretty desolate place, there's a lot of really fascinating materials and science locked up in that regolith.
That's fascinating. Thank you. And one of the things that's interesting to me in terms of the development of lunar bases is this year, China and Russia announced that they are going to jointly be building a moon base. Does the reality staring us in the face of not only having US and private-led lunar bases, but also the reality of multiple lunar bases in our lifetime, which I never thought would really happen, does that point to an increasing risk of conflict over lunar resources?
I would say that's certainly a possibility. And that's something that a lot of people are really trying to do, is to establish, you know, this week in Dubai, they're having a meeting called the International Astronautical Congress. Meets every year, and this year it's in Dubai. Next year it'll be in Paris. And a bunch of really smart people get together, and they have a whole bunch of committees and things. And some of the committees are basically looking at this. What are the rules of the road? So the only real big international treaty that we have right now is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. And it's, I think generously you could call it vague. And it was intentionally vague. But now that people are trying to say, well, now that multiple people can go. So in that treaty, it says that nobody can own the moon. You can't just go and claim sovereignty and everything. But one of the things is it also says if you want to withdraw the treaty, you can do so on 1 year's notice. So that's the question and so the moon is one thing. And then you've got the other one is what about the asteroids? And you've got some of these what are called near Earth asteroids that actually come fairly close to the orbit of the Earth. In some cases, they cross the orbit of the Earth, which means that they're an impact hazard. So on one hand, you worry about, is this going to be another dinosaur extinction level event? Or is this a source of resources that we could use to make the first trillionaire? So, or a little bit of both. So there's a lot of these issues that are up for discussion. And, the other one that's a real big one that everybody's trying to do with is orbital debris. That's another one that's kind of really gotten, it's starting to, I think, finally get the attention that it deserves there. But you've got, on one hand, you want to have these communications, so you want to be able to put up these constellations, because of the capabilities those enable you to have. But on the thing, you don't want this to turn into the world's biggest, case of, destruction derby.
Right. The gold rush for low Earth objects. Yes. Well, that's great. I want to leave a few minutes for folks to ask questions, but the one topic I'd love to hear your thoughts on is education.
Okay.
You studied mechanical engineering and aerospace engineering at UC Davis, go Aggies, and you studied engineering management as well at Santa Clara. And
right.
You're still involved heavily with multiple educational efforts. But more interesting to me, you were an instructor at NASA and you trained hundreds of engineers and engineering managers in dynamic system engineering.
Right.
What do you think in all that time, does anything bubble to the surface that you find what are the qualities that make a good engineer? And do you think that's changed over the past 30 years or so?
I haven't heard that question before. I don't think that the qualities have changed. I just think it's a lot easier now because there's so many neat tools out there. Obviously the computer revolution, the internet revolution, AI, ML kinds of things. Just make it easier to do stuff. I think the thing that has fundamentally changed, and I think this is a good thing, and I'll use myself as an example. In my generation, it was basically, you were used to watching other people do things. And watch people doing experiments or building stuff or something like that, and you would try to learn from what they were doing. I think now it's much more hands-on, and people want to do it themselves. The young people, they don't want to watch somebody else do it. They want to get in there, they want to do it. And so the hackathons and maker fairs and all those things, I think, are a really great opportunity for people to try out and see what they can do. And sometimes you really surprise yourself and you think, well, I can't do that. And then turn out, well, son of a gun, I can. So I think that's really exciting. And I've been really happy to see this. And then the fact that you can collaborate with people, all around the world on these various projects and things like that. Like, some of the things I do with the National Space Society and some of the stuff I'm doing, I've got another not-for-profit called the Future Frontiers Institute, and then the Frontier Development Lab that we did with NASA and the SETI Institute. These are all examples of organizations that are finding new ways to bring people together from varying different disciplines to work on these really gnarly multidisciplinary problems. And one of the good news and the bad news is a lot of the easy problems have been solved. The ones that left are we call them wicked problems. They're really wickedly, challenging to do. And those tend to be inherently multidisciplinary. So this ability to be able to work with people from multiple disciplines and being able to communicate with each other and listen and understand each other, that's a really valuable skill to develop. And that's what I tried to get across in the system engineering. Is the people that are really expertises in their domain are valuable, but the people that can cross multiple domains, to me, they're even more valuable, and they're kind of like the thing that hooks the whole quilt together. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of strings and threads.
That's excellent. Thank you. And I think that also highlights some challenges we face, which is working in silos only gets you so far. And taking a multidisciplinary approach gets us all, gives us the chance to go farther together.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Bruce. We have a few questions from the audience, so we will present those, and I'll take a moment to read them just so everyone can hear what we're asking. Sammy asked, "What have been your biggest takeaways from working with NASA?" I know that's broad, but it can be about life, work, the government, aliens, etc.
Wow. I guess, I would have a couple of takeaways from this. One is I would say, follow your passion. That the people that I found that really make a difference are the one that feel passionately that what they're doing is important, and that they feel, emotionally invested in solving this problem or producing this product or whatever it is. So, it's kind of a cliche now, but kind of follow your passion. The other part of this is it's a marathon and not a sprint. So, it's kind of a cliche also about work-life balance, but you really need to focus on that. And especially if you're a manager, to be able to look out after your people and to make sure that they are being taken care of, and because they're the opposite sides. If you've got some people that are really passionate about what they're doing and are really excited about it, they will work themselves to death. And so sometimes you just got to tell them, I don't want to see you this weekend, go home, get some rest, and so getting people to look after themselves, or to encourage them to look after themselves, I think that's really important. And then the other thing, that I learned that's really important, and one of the things that kind of drives me at the point that I am in my career, is all of the people that helped me when I was young and that were very generous with their time and their advice and counsel and everything. You can't pay it back, but you can pay it forward. So I would encourage you to do that, to look at places where you can pay it forward to the next generation that are coming up behind you, whether that's kids in elementary school or high school or college or young professionals or whatever it is, whatever stage of the career you're in, but look for places where you can pay it forward. I think that, one, is I found it to be extremely rewarding, and two, I think that's the hope for the future. As I remind my students, there's plenty of new mistakes to be made without making the old ones over again.
Well, that's really helpful. As a manager of a very hardworking team, I will take several of those lessons to heart. So thank you. Let's see, what's our next question here? Oh, did we have one before that, or did I get these out of order?
Well, the worst space food has to be the ice cream. Don't eat the ice cream. Just not good. Some of it is not bad. It's getting better. I think the best stuff right now is they actually have they've got this thing they call the vegetable machine, so they can actually grow some of their own greeneries, lettuce and green stuff in space now, and I think the astronauts think that that's kind of the best up there. But this is another one of those things, for you guys, is this this actually 3D printed food now is actually, I think, going to be, I've got some friends that are experts in synthetic biology. So when you start looking at this and some of the other things that are coming along, you're probably never going to have cows on Mars, but you still might be able to get a steak someday with the synthesizer, or some other kind of mechanism like they had in Star Trek, the replicator.
Exactly. Well, we already have Beyond Burgers. It takes a whole new level if you go beyond Mars, I suppose. So there were two questions that were pretty similar, and I think we can coalesce them into one, which, as Blake asked here, what's the realistic time frame for space travel to be common to the average person? Or to put it another way, how do we bring space travel to the level that's accessible to a more socioeconomically diverse group?
Well, I'll use Elon as an example here again. If he can come anywhere close to doing what he said he's going to do with Starship, he's basically saying that he can put up 100 tons into orbit And right now he's saying that he thinks, and I don't know when this will happen, will this be 10 years or 15 years? But he thinks he could get the marginal cost of adding one more flight down to less than $1 million. Wow. So if you do the thing, and they're actually talking about doing this point-to-point stuff right now, where you could like take off from Los Angeles and land 30 minutes later in Australia. And if he can do that, you could get to go to space. And he's saying that you could do that for less than the equal to or less than the cost of a business class ticket on a normal airliner. So that could happen, I think, easily within 10 years. So I would say it's not right around the corner, but I think that that the most of the people listening to this, I think don't give up hope. I think you'll get a shot at it.
That's excellent. I tell my daughters that all the time, that I may never go to space, but I have a strong suspicion that you might have the chance.
Well, and the other part is, what is the average person nowadays? So, it's not probably going to get to the point where, it's like going to the movies, but it's like one of those things. If you wanted to save up for a luxury vacation, like say you wanted to go to Antarctica or something like that, you wanted to do a really, high-end vacation. I think it will get to the point where the average person that's willing to save up and do this will be able to do it within, 10 or 15 years.
Well, I'm going to take a note on that and start saving for my kids' space fund today.
Yeah.
Well, Bruce, thank you so much. It's been a real delight to interview you. Thank you for spending the time with us. Thank you for those who asked questions. And Bruce, I hope you have a great day.
And good luck with your hackathon, guys.